User requirements are requirements for the users and generally from the users as well. Remember, we talked about internal users being one of your primary stakeholder classes because they were so impacted by the product, because they would be the ones using it on a day-to-day basis. Well, for that reason, we need to include them in the requirement gathering process. But even though we're using an internal-only application as our example, if you have a customer-facing product, you'll want to include actual customers in your requirement gathering as well. User requirements are typically much larger in number and often complexity than your business requirements. Where business requirements tend to be high level, user requirements are, well, let's say mid-level. They aren't as specific as functional requirements a lot of the time, which we'll cover as our next requirement type, by the way. But they tend to be more nitty-gritty than business requirements. Now, remember that I prefaced our discussion of business requirements with a warning about different terminology used in many organizations. Well, the crux of it is this. Many organizations call business requirements project objectives. And sometimes they call user requirements business requirements. And that can be a little tricky. This keeps things, nice and simple, because then you only have business requirements and functional requirements. And I actually did that myself for years. But there is a drawback to this approach, and that drawback is real. Essentially, what they call the project objectives tend to be forgotten, ironically. They aren't implemented, they aren't tested, they aren't released, they're not really reviewed for rigor, and that's a problem. Another problem is that this de-emphasizes the importance of gathering requirements from the users themselves. And then you might end up with a product that meets the goals of one stakeholder, your sponsor, without meeting the goals of your other stakeholders, your customers or internal users. I recommend that you follow the approach laid out here, which I believe was originally proposed by Carl Wiegers in his book Software Requirements. I can double check that. And by the way, that's a book that you need to read, and I'm going to put that on our reading list for this course. Okay, anyway, back to user requirements. Generally, the best way to gather user requirements is by having discussions with the users, but there are a number of ways to gather them. I'm going to hold off on that particular topic until the next lecture, but assume for now that we have gathered a bunch of user requirements from the user of the system, and in our example here, that's going to be the product analyst, Martha Warren. And here's the first user requirement. This looks very similar to the table of business requirements we were looking at before. We have a column for the requirement ID, and we've started referring to these user requirements as beginning with the prefix UR. The actual requirement is also listed here. The summary report will list each of the beverage products available for sale by the organization. Okay, this requirement seems pretty clear. It doesn't say that it'll list all the beverages because it's not clear what set of beverages that implies. It also highlights for the development team that we need to list beverages that haven't been sold over the given time frame, which is a good thing to know. In the next column, we have the rationale for the requirement. All right, list of products is critical to understanding the report. Very good. That makes sense. We also have the source of the requirement listed. That's Martha. And then we have a new column called the parent. And for this user requirement, we have a value BR2. Okay, what does that mean? Well, the parent column signifies that the user requirement either belongs to or is derived from a bigger requirement. In the case of UR1, it is BR2, business requirement 2. And that is kind of blown out here in that little oval on the screen. System will enable a user to create summary reports of all beverages sold monthly. Including the parent on derived requirements helps us to create a hierarchy of requirements, which is really helpful for organizing the collection. It also helps us by tracing the requirement, which we spoke about earlier. When you combine the last three columns together, the rationale, the source, and the parent, you get a good idea of where the requirement comes from and why it's important. In other words, for this requirement, Martha Warren, the product analyst, says that her requirement is critical to understanding the report described in business requirement BR2. Okay. For purposes of this example, we're not going to come up with dozens of user requirements, which is certainly what you will do in real life. We'll just come up with a couple more examples, and there they are on the screen. I think both of the requirements we see added to the table make sense, so I won't cover them in detail. I will highlight the rationale of UR2. From reading it, you kind of get a sense that this requirement is not critical, but only helpful to stakeholders. This kind of information, I'll just say, that makes it a little bit more obvious for the sponsor when it's time for them to prioritize their requirements. But that happens later on. All right, so that's pretty much wrapping up user requirements. Let us summarize here. User requirements are for users and usually come from users. These can be users internal to your organization or actual customers, either way. There tend to be many more user requirements than business requirements, and indeed, user requirements should derive from business requirements. For this reason, we track the parent business requirement of each user requirement. Also, some organizations tend to lump business and user requirements together. It's not necessarily wrong, but it does have some shortfalls, and I recommend that you keep those separate, as we've been doing in our examples so far. Okay, with that, we can move on to the next type of requirement, the functional requirement.